My name is Ron Husmann, and I want to tell you about this street. It's called Broadway. It's one of the oldest streets in New York City. Before the Dutch settled in New York, this street was an Indian trading route. The name Broadway has also become synonymous with the theater, because most of the theater houses have been located either on or in near proximity to this street for over 200 years. Today, the musical is found in theaters on and around Broadway from 44th Street up to 52nd Street. It's a special place for me because it's where I made my living as a singer-actor off and on for the past 30 years, starring in shows like Tenderloin, All-American, Lovely Ladies, Kind Gentlemen, On the Town, Irene, and Can-Can. This is the home of the Broadway musical, and I want to talk about its beginnings, where it came from, and how it developed to the present day. All this will be told through pictures and interviews with the people who made Broadway. In addition, the first two tapes will include samples of the music from important trend-setting shows. It will be performed by Miss Holly Saunders and myself. My principal source is Stanley Green's Broadway musical Show by Show, which is included with these tapes, and from which I shall quote directly from time to time.
This particular book is a combination history, guide, fact book, picture album of the most memorable productions seen in New York from 1866 to the present.
A note to you teachers, the video will not always follow the book page by page. Within each section, we may follow one composer for 2 or 3 years and then go back in time and pick up the narrative. Other sources will include historian Gerald Boardman and his book, American Musical Theater, historian Ethan Mordden and his book, Broadway Babies, and finally, historian Miles Kreuger from the Institute of the American Musical and his book, Showboat. I highly recommend these books for additional study along with this course. At the end of the series, you'll find an additional list of books by these authors and others that will further enhance your study of the musical theater. So, with the help of these 4 historians and many interviews with various celebrities from Broadway, we'll take you through Broadway, a musical history. Before we begin, it's important to understand that theater, like every other kind of human experience, does not exist in a vacuum. From time to time, I will refer to historical events which had an important impact on the musical theater. Now, in order to understand the musical theater of the 20th century, we have to first look at a few 19th century theatrical precedents. It all started on the corner of Broadway and Prince Street in Lower Manhattan. In 1866, just after the Civil War, right here on this corner, there used to be a theater called Niblo's Garden. It was here that New York saw a major turning point in the American musical theater. An extravaganza called The Black Crook opened and was the first successful long-run Broadway musical.
And it had all kinds of scenic effects there, the most advanced of its time. And the fact that they had about 100 dancing girls, ballet dancers, who had been supposed to open at a different theater, but who never got to open at this theater because it had burnt down. They never even came to this country until they were hired to appear in The Black Crook. And they sailed over here and they put the two together.
This was not a smoothly polished show. Crude as it was, it caused a sensation, not the least of which was all those dancers with bare arms and legs. Remember, this was 1866. Women wore hoop skirts and looked like this. They were covered from head to toe.
They had that kind of old-fashioned Lillian Russell, sort of what they call the hourglass figure. They were very buxom, Police Gazette type of women.
One clergyman went to see The Black Crook for himself and reported his findings in a letter to the New York Sun. He spoke of the immodest dress of the girls, ladies dancing so as to make their undergarments spring up, exposing the figure beneath from waist to the toe. Letters like this probably did more for the box office than all the advertising in the world.
I will never more deceive you or of happiness bereave you, but I'll die amid to grieve you, oh you naughty, naughty men. You may talk of love and sighing, say for us you're nearly dying, all the while you know you're trying to deceive, you naughty men.
The Black Crook was so popular, it ran on and off in New York and on tour across the country in various productions for the next 40 years. In 1879, the American Musical Theater took a second step forward with vaudeville performers Ned Harrigan and Tony Hart, who wrote and acted in popular comedy sketches.
My father, his name was Edward Harrigan, and a great deal of his success, his early success, was with a man by the name of Hart. So it was Harrigan and Hart. And then Hart died quite young, so my father went on from there. And there were a series of sketches called the Mulligans, and my father made plays, and that was the first musical play with a plot that was done in America, and he continued and made a series of 8 from the Mulligans. But all in all, he wrote over 40 plays, and they're all at the library, at the Lincoln Library. And then my mother's father wrote all the music, and they...
His name was?
His name was David Braham. We owned a theater. My father built a theater called the Harrigan Theater, and it was later called the Garrick Theater.
It comes in the middle of the 1870s with Ned Harrigan and Tony Hart, who began what are surprisingly modern-looking musicals. Naturally, their roots were in variety of the period, and they did not write about princes in Romania and things like that. It was all about the local people in that area. They would show the titles like The Widow Nolan's Goat. Of course, there were entertainments. There were absolutely no doubt that they would stop and there would be a number that may not have been pushed the show forward or pushed the plot forward. But for the most part, it's amazing when you read these, when you look at those numbers and you read the plays, and I read enough of them, to see how they did, the songs did further the plot. And it all begins with them.
It was really a play depending heavily on New York ethnic types, particularly the Irish and the blacks. But essentially a play with song.
1879 also yielded a third major contribution to the Broadway musical as we know it. It's the time of the Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, here described by Miles Kreuger.
Well, Gilbert and Sullivan had written 3 earlier comic operas, Thespis, Trial by Jury, and The Sorcerer, and no one was really prepared for the unbelievable success in 1878 of HMS Pinafore, which was, of course, a parody of the British Navy, and it just swept the British Isles. It was an immense, immense hit. No one had ever seen such a success ever, and word of its success reached these shores, and because of the poverty of the international copyright laws at the time, everybody began to pirate the show in America. And so there were amateur productions, and there were midget productions, and there were all sorts of eccentric productions, and some professional ones as well. And by this time, D'Oyly Carte, who was the producer for Gilbert and Sullivan, and the 2 writers themselves began to become very upset about this, because first of all, the show was being misrepresented very substantially, and secondly, they weren't getting a nickel of royalties. So they decided in 1879 that they would cross the Atlantic, and they would show America what a real Gilbert and Sullivan production looked like. And so they decided not only would they present HMS Pinafore for the first time properly in the United States at an engagement of the Fifth Avenue Theater, but they would also do the world premiere of the 5th Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, The Pirates of Penzance, right in New York City, as a kind of treat for the Americans. So they set sail, and they were halfway across the Atlantic, and Gilbert and Sullivan decided they would have a rehearsal of this new work, The Pirates of Penzance. So they turned to each other and said, well, let's get out the score and we'll get the cast rehearsing on the deck. And they had forgotten the material. It was left behind. And to secure the British copyright, there had to be some sort of a run-through in England of the material. And what they had was a third company, you know, like their understudies, the apprentices of the company, perform in a little theater in a small seaside town called Paynton. And what they did was wear their HMS Pinafore costumes, put little bandanas and patches over their eyes, and that made them pirates, you see. And that was enough to secure the copyright for London, for England. But meanwhile, there was no text nor score for the American show. So they locked themselves into their hotel room in December 1879, and The Pirates of Penzance, as we know it today, was written in New York City. It is not a British comic opera, despite everybody's thinking it is. It is an American work, as American as Oklahoma, written by two Englishmen in New York City, almost entirely. One or two songs were left over because they could remember those songs. And they remembered something from Thespis, which they put into it. But other than that, The Pirates of Penzance was written here. But Pinafore, of course, was the rage, and what it did for the American musical theater was to raise the level of literacy and the quality of writing to a level that had never been attained before. Very important, and it influenced the next 30 years of the American musical theater until The Merry Widow came along in 1907.
Because of the importance of the lyrics, the style of Gilbert and Sullivan, even in its major songs, is very close to what in opera is called recitative. Here's a little sample from HMS Pinafore.
When I was a lad, I served a term as office boy to an attorney's firm. I cleaned the windows and I swept the floors, polished up the handles on the big front doors. I polished up the handles so carefully that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy.
With The Black Crook, Harrigan and Hart's Mulligan Guards, and Gilbert and Sullivan, we have the 19th century basis for modern musical comedy. But before we reach the turn of the century, I'd like to touch on a few isolated shows that also shaped our musical future. In the early 90s, we encounter Robin Hood, a popular musical based on the familiar legend of Robin and his merry men in Sherwood Forest. What most people don't know is that Oh Promise Me, which has today become synonymous with weddings, was first heard in this score. Incidentally, it was sung by a girl dressed as a man and playing a male part. In those days, that was called a trouser role.
Oh, promise me that someday you and I will take our love together to some sky where we can be alone and faith renew and find the hollows where those flowers grew.
They also paced their shows a lot more slowly. Gerald Boardman gives us some insight on 19th century staging.
Henry Clay Barnaby's autobiography, the original sheriff in de Koven's Robin Hood, he tells of the leading man coming in, and the introduction to the song is given. The man walked completely around the stage looking at the clouds, got back to where he started, and then was able to sing the song. The artificial staging.
Robin Hood was a very popular production and was soon followed in 1891 by an even more successful show, A Trip to Chinatown.
Two young couples are encouraged by a coquettish widow to defy a rich merchant by having a merry time in the town at a fashionable restaurant. Complications arise when the merchant also shows up at the restaurant and is stuck with the bill, which he cannot pay because he doesn't have his wallet. Now that outline, of course, is very similar to another show that I'm sure that you're familiar with called Hello, Dolly.
You might not remember the show, but I think you'll remember some of the songs from it, like The Bowery and Reuben and Cynthia. If you don't remember Reuben and Cynthia, it begins, Reuben, Reuben, I've been thinking. And of course, After the Ball, which was added during the week.
The Bowery, they do such things and they say strange things on the Bowery, I'll never go there anymore.
I'm moving rather rapidly now toward the turn of the century, but it's important to note that a production entitled The Passing Show appeared in 1894. The Passing Show was a revue. This was a topical entertainment without a plot, commenting on political, social, and theatrical happenings of the past year. It differed from vaudeville, since in vaudeville, performers did their own special material as separate acts with no interplay between them. Revues often had themes and used a company of actors who appeared in different scenes throughout the evening. The revue would become one of the most popular musical theater forms for the next 50 years. It might be said that 20th century Broadway actually began in 1898 with the success of our first major American composer, Victor Herbert. Although he was born in Ireland and raised in Stuttgart, Germany, it wasn't until after he emigrated to New York that he began to write for the Broadway stage. He began his career as a band conductor. He also composed several mildly successful operettas. But in 1898, The Fortune Teller firmly established Victor Herbert's preeminence as America's foremost comic opera composer. The Gypsy Love Song from The Fortune Teller is a good example of the kind of melodies that made Victor Herbert famous.
Slumber on, my little gypsy sweetheart. Dream of the field and the grove. Can you hear me in that dreamland where your fancies roam?
Victor Herbert was a trained musician. So were all the men who wrote operettas, so trained that, as Stanley said, they did their own orchestrations and conducted the music whenever they had to.
Victor Herbert's methods of achieving inspiration, however, are not recommended.
When he was working on 3 shows at one time, and for one show he would drink a certain kind of wine, for another show he'd drink another kind of wine, and the third show, whether that's true or not, I don't know.
We'll hear more of Victor Herbert, but for now, let's retrace our steps back to 1896. That year, a musical play entitled A Parlor Match was produced by a young man from Chicago by the name of Florence Ziegfeld, Jr. He was to become the foremost producer of musical extravaganzas for the next 35 years. According to his personal secretary, Goldie Clow, Ziegfeld's flamboyant expenditures, both on his productions and in his private life, were unequaled.
He was actually the most extravagant man, I think, who ever lived. The sets would come on. Joseph Urban would design the sets, and we'd have a rehearsal of the sets. And there'd be one little thing in that set that he didn't like. And he'd call Joseph Urban and say, I don't like that, that's terrible. And Joseph would say, well, I'll take it out. No, throw the whole set out. Do it over. And that set would probably have cost $50,000, if not more. But that's the way he did it. We had a box in the office that looked down into the theater, and we could see the whole show from that box. It was way high up. But he had the eyes of an eagle. And there was just a tiny little spot on a girl's tights or something. He'd scream for me, go down and tell that so-and-so, take those tights off and put a clean pair on. Get the wardrobe, missus. How could she have that on that costume like that? Throw it out, throw it out. The costume may have cost $1,000, but the heck with it, you know. If he didn't like one little thing, that was it.
His name became synonymous with beautiful women because, as we shall see, he spent his career glorifying them. The star of A Parlor Match was Anna Held. Ziegfeld had seen her in England, fallen in love with her, and brought her to America, where they were eventually married. Ziegfeld also recognized the importance of publicity. For example, he told the newspapers that Anna Held took milk baths every day to preserve her delicate white-skinned complexion. He surrounded Miss Held with beautiful costumes, sets, and most importantly, a chorus of beautiful girls who created a sensation when he had them remove their silk stockings in full view of the audience. Remember, in this period, women kept their arms and legs covered even at the beach. Ziegfeld wasn't the only one to offer choruses of beautiful girls. A British import in 1900, named after a mythical island in the South Seas called Florodora, became a huge hit in New York.
British musical comedy, which was integrated as early as 1899, 1900, 1901. The famous one is Florodora, which I think came here in 1901. Those were much more integrated than ours were. The British have pantomime for those loosely structured musicals with the comics. So their musical comedies tended to be very serious storytelling shows with very, very full scores, very full. They would have something like 25 numbers, maybe even 30, and they'd pull some in and pull some out kind of thing.
The most important aspect of the show occurred in the second act, when a sextet of beautiful chorus girls, each escorted by a gentleman, sang, "Tell Me, Pretty Maiden."
Tell me, pretty maiden, are there any more at home like you?
There are a few, kind sir, but simple girls and proper too.
Then tell me, pretty maiden, what these very simple girlies do.
Kind sir, their manners are perfection and the opposite of mine.
This was the first time the hit song in a Broadway musical was sung by the chorus and not the star. Men used to come to the show just to see the second act, and after the performance, they would ply the girls with expensive gifts and flowers. The publicity about the chorus girls and their stage door Johnnies did much to enhance the popularity of the show. We have not as yet talked about blacks in musical theater. Ironically, their image began with whites appearing in blackface, in caricature stereotypes, in a form of musical theater known as minstrel shows. Minstrel shows grew in popularity and in size well into the 20th century. Without any storyline, they relied mostly on jokes, music, specialties, and Negro dancing, which was based on the shuffle. Ultimately, it would lead to the soft shoe and tap dancing. White performers in blackface would be copied in time by black performers in black burnt cork makeup. There was one breakthrough in 1903 when the first successful all-black musical called In Dahomey opened for a long Broadway run. It starred the black vaudeville team of George Walker and Bert Williams. Williams would later gain fame on his own as a headliner in the Ziegfeld Follies. It is now 1903, and a musicalized version of The Wizard of Oz starring comedians Montgomery and Stone was Broadway's biggest hit. Its producer asked Victor Herbert to compose the music for another children's story, Babes in Toyland. Not only was it a hit, but the score was an instantaneous success throughout the country.
Toyland, Toyland, little girl and boyland, while you dwell within it, you are ever happy there. Childhood's joyland, mystic merry toyland, once you pass its borders, you can ne'er return again.
Along with Victor Herbert and Ziegfeld, the other most important influence in the early part of this century was an energetic, brash young man by the name of George M. Cohan.
With Cohan, you had the man who was also a director, also a producer, also an actor, also a hoofer, also a singer, whatever. As somebody once said, out of the corner of his mouth and through one nostril was the way he sang. But he personified the musical comedy creator par excellence at that time, because he was a primitive, as opposed to the whole school of Victor Herbert. And before Victor Herbert was Reginald de Koven, who was an American composer.
When we talk about Cohan, we must also remember that in 1898, the Spanish-American War fueled the rising nationalism in this country. America was beginning to see itself as a world power with pride in things American. George M. Cohan captured this spirit in his flag-waving musicals. Here is Broadway librettist Michael Stewart, who wrote the biographical musical George M., with some insight on Cohan.
There is a vigor about his music that represented America at the time that you will never find again. Never, ever, ever. Some of those old songs that are on the back of the end of the record of George M. There's about 10 or 12 songs. You just listen to those songs that nobody ever heard of, and you hear the vitality in life that is absolutely typical of the country of the period. He represented the country.
Born on the 4th of July, Cohan was trained in vaudeville. The four Cohans were very popular on the vaudeville circuit, with George himself receiving a salary of $1,000 per week by the turn of the century. His first two shows on Broadway were, in reality, extended vaudeville sketches, and were only mildly successful. However, his persistence paid off, and in 1904, he came back to Broadway with what was to be his first big hit, Little Johnny Jones. Loosely based on a true story of an American jockey who goes to England, is accused of throwing a race, and is finally vindicated, Little Johnny Jones contained two songs that were to be forever connected with Cohan, Yankee Doodle Boy and Give My Regards to Broadway.
I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy, a Yankee Doodle do or die, a real live little sweetheart. She's my Yankee Doodle joy. Yankee Doodle went to London just to ride the ponies. I am that Yankee Doodle boy. Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me to Herald Square. Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I will soon be there. Whisper of how I'm yearning to mingle with the old-time throng. Give my regards to old Broadway and tell them I'll be there ere long.
Cohan's songs were fresh and new, and the essence of American optimism at the beginning of a new century. His very next show, 45 Minutes from Broadway, contained 3 more hits: So Long Mary, the title song, 45 Minutes from Broadway, and the most popular of all, Mary's a Grand Old Name.
It was Mary, Mary, plain as any name can be, but with propriety, society will say Mary, but it was Mary, Mary, long before the fashions came, and there is something there that sounds so fair. It's a grand old name.
Retracing our steps, 1905 saw 3 more Victor Herbert scores, including Mademoiselle Modiste with Fritzi Scheff, a star from the Metropolitan Opera. Her rendition of Kiss Me Again made it the #1 hit song in the country.
Sweet summer breeze, whispering trees, stars shining softly above, roses in bloom, wafted perfume, sleepy birds dreaming of love, safe in your arms, far from alarms, daylight shall come, but in vain, tenderly pressed, close to my breast, kiss me again, kiss me again, kiss me
Again, Herbert came up with 3 more scores in the following year, 1906, including one of his biggest hits ever, The Red Mill. The Red Mill was written especially for comics Montgomery and Stone, who had been the stars of The Wizard of Oz. It was the longest run on Broadway of any of Herbert's shows during his lifetime. Set in Holland, it provided a romp for Montgomery and Stone as 2 Americans abroad.
Moonbeam shining soft above, let me beg of you, find the one I dearly love, tell him I'll let me true.
Every day is Ladies' Day with me. I'm quite at their disposal all the while, and my pleasure it is double if they come to me in trouble, for I always find a way to make them smile. In old New York, the peach crops always fine.
They're sweet and fair, and on the square,
The maids of Manhattan for mine. You cannot see
in gay Paris,
in London or
It also had a huge turning windmill in front of the theater, lighted with electric lights. This was the first electric marquee on Broadway.
Our memory of Victor Herbert doesn't come from those shows. They're all gone, for the most part. They come from the movies that MacDonald and Eddie made of some of the Herbert shows, like Sweethearts. And what MGM did was they take these scores that are basically musical comedy scores. They are not big operettas, for the most part, Herbert shows. They throw out everything that can't be sung by two trained voices. They just leave 3 or 4 romantic numbers, and maybe 1 number for the chorus. And we see these movies and we think, oh, that's what Victor Herbert is like. Well, that is not what Victor Herbert is like. He had the star comic. He wrote a lot of musical comedies. He wrote shows for Montgomery and Stone, for instance.
By 1906, the Broadway stage, though still dominated by European imports, did contain some important American originals: Victor Herbert, George M. Cohan, and Florence Ziegfeld. Still searching for its form, Broadway was about to embrace a new musical element that would strongly influence the theater right up to the present day. The first major theatrical innovation occurred in July when Florence Ziegfeld introduced The Follies of 1907 at the Jardin de Paris on the roof garden of the New York Theater. It was Anna Held, Ziegfeld's French wife, who suggested that New Yorkers would enjoy the kind of satirical revue so popular in Paris, consisting of humorous commentary on the political, social, and theatrical happenings of the day. For his Follies of 1907, Ziegfeld used a slight plot: Pocahontas and Captain John Smith being introduced to modern American life, stringing together various characters then popular in current society: John D. Rockefeller, Teddy Roosevelt, Oscar Hammerstein I, and Enrico Caruso. Also in the show were 50 beautiful chorus girls whom Ziegfeld billed as the Anna Held Girls, drawing on the fame of his glamorous wife. They were to become the first in a series of showgirls, a Ziegfeld trademark that would epitomize his productions.
One of those Ziegfeld numbers, the way Ziegfeld staged them, they're often imitated. Basically, it's a song being played over and over again, and these incredible-looking women are coming out one by one, sometimes in 2s and 3s. All they do is walk across the stage in extremely abbreviated costumes. And people today are going, well, they look terrific, but what is this for? But in Ziegfeld's day, no one said, what is this for? They knew what it was for. This was great, and only Ziegfeld could pull that off. And I don't know why, because looking at them, I would think it'd be very, you know, all you have to do is have terrific taste in women, I guess good taste in extremely abbreviated costumes, and just teach them how to walk with their head held high across the stage, but no one else could do it.
The title, Follies of 1907, was named after a newspaper column, Follies of the Day, by Harry B. Smith, who also wrote the sketches for the show. The production was so profitable that Ziegfeld decided to bring back another edition the following year. It's also important to remember that this was only a beginning. The Follies of 1907 was nowhere near as elaborate as future editions would become. As a matter of fact, the first edition cost only $13,000, a modest sum even in 1907.
There were certain parts to a Ziegfeld show. There was, first of all, the chorus line, the girls, very attractive girls. This hangs over from the earliest days when theater was really the word actress was a euphemism for something else. And men were supposed to go to the theater to see these attractive women. That was part of the show. And Ziegfeld thought, well, of course. You know, here's Hammerstein saying, no, the chorus has to be what the chorus is. You don't just bring the girls on because it's fun to look at the girls in these costumes. Ziegfeld says, yes, it is. Yes, it is. That's why we bring them on, because it's fun and that's what I want. It's a Ziegfeld show. That's what I'm known for. People are going to know about me for that. And that is how he made his mark.
The Follies continued on a yearly basis, each successive mounting growing in splendor and pulchritude. In the previous segment, we mentioned black performer Bert Williams. In 1910, Ziegfeld added Williams to the Follies. But what was most significant about this move was that this was an act of bravery on Ziegfeld's part. Even though Williams was immensely popular, up to this point there was no mixing of black performers into white musicals or plays for that matter. And Williams would be the only black to perform with whites until 1927. Also in 1910, Ziegfeld introduced comedian Fanny Brice, famous for her Yiddish dialect and her torch songs. In 1911, Ziegfeld would officially add his name to the title by calling the revue the Ziegfeld Follies of 1911. The second major development in the theater in 1907 was a Viennese operetta import, The Merry Widow. Because the original production of The Merry Widow had already been playing in Vienna since 1905 and in London since June of 1907, the American audience was already familiar with the title and the melodic score. It was therefore eagerly awaited, and when it finally arrived in October, the American audience and the critics were not disappointed. As a matter of fact, the Viennese tradition thoroughly dominated Broadway for the next 7 years.
The Viennese and German operettas, I think what they taught our people was you have to take the love plot more seriously, because our musicals tended to be star comic with the kind of love couple running around. Every now and then he would go back to his dressing room to change his clothes, and they'd come out and sing a duet. And what Merry Widow says is, and it has a comic too, but it says comic is not going to be as interesting as two people who are really in love and we're going to use this waltz stuff. And you're really going to enjoy this and you're going to believe in the love plot. I think that was the major contribution there. And The Merry Widow particularly, it's a very sensual show. You really care about these two leads. The fact that they do love each other, they have been together before, but now she's too rich for his dignity and they're having a problem getting together. Also, they play the comedy themselves. They are not just, stand and deliver love objects. They are very funny people. This is the beginning, all the way back in like 1905, 1907, of the end of the star comic, because the star comic supplied the comedy and didn't do much else. Maybe did a funny dance or sang a funny song. But what authors started to say was, well, we can spread the comedy around. We can put the comedy into the story, give it to every character, but then who needs the star comic?
What you have to understand about the music in The Merry Widow was the grand sweep of Franz Lehar's beautiful waltz melodies. One of the most popular songs from the show, Vilja, demonstrates Lehar's Viennese style.
Vilja, oh Vilja, the witch of the wood, gladly I'd die for you, dear, if I could. Vilja, oh Vilja, haunting you seem. Can you be more than a dream?
The Merry Widow caused a dance craze not only for the waltz, but for other intricate ballroom steps. Women began wearing huge Merry Widow hats, and of course the corset bearing the name remained with us well into the 50s. For those of you who may not know, it was formed with stays to give the ladies an hourglass figure, curvaceous bust and hips with tiny nipped-in waists.
Every thought I'm hiding whispers what I know. Though I try, I can't deny I love you so.
The story of the Merry Widow would be imitated often. A wealthy widow from mythical Marsovia is being pursued by fortune hunters while visiting in Paris. The Marsovian ambassador is anxious for her to marry a Marsovian so that her fortune will stay in the country. He sets his attaché, Prince Danilo, to pursue her. They eventually fall in love, and Danilo, being a man of pride, only proposes when he thinks she has lost all her money. Since she only pretended to be poor, they end up marrying, the money stays in Marsovia, and all live happily ever after. The elegant settings and costumes, Franz Lehar's luscious score, and most importantly, the beautiful sweep of the waltzing dancers, made the Viennese operetta a style that would remain long after its initial vogue in the 7-year period. George M. Cohan was still very much a presence on Broadway in 1908 with his new musical, 50 Miles from Boston. In it, he named one of his characters Harrigan after his idol Ned Harrigan of Harrigan and Hart. He even wrote this song for the character to sing.
H-A-R-R-I-G-A-N spells Harrigan. I'm proud of all the Irish blood that's in me. Devil a man can say a word again me. H-A-R-R-I-G-A-N-U-C is a name that a shame never has been connected with Harrigan. That's me.
Ned Harrigan was invited to the opening night. The emotion of the evening inspired several encores of the song. However, the show only played 4 weeks. Audiences had become aware that Cohan musicals had grown repetitive.
So I know more about Cohan the man and his heartbreak and disappointment at being as vigorous a musical comedy talent as he was at the end of his career and being unaccepted, because he was unaccepted. Those last shows were not accepted.
Victor Herbert, unlike Cohan, was able to ride the crest of Viennese popularity. In 1907, 8, and 9, he wrote 5 comic operas. But in 1910, he outdid himself.
Oscar Hammerstein I was a major producer of opera, grand opera, in the United States. And he had an opera company located in his opera house on 34th Street. It's still there. It's now called Manhattan Center. And the problem in New York was that there was a tremendous rivalry between his opera company and the Metropolitan. They formed an alliance in which Oscar Hammerstein I, the grandfather of the famous librettist that we know of, the Rodgers and Hammerstein team, was going to give up producing grand opera in New York City, Philadelphia, and several other major cities in the United States where the Met toured for a period of 10 years. He had left over some of his opera singers, his conductor, Gaetano Merola, and of course the chorus. Now, what do you do when you have a whole bunch of opera singers and an opera conductor and no opera house and you're not allowed to present opera? What you do is you hire the most prestigious composer for the American musical theater, Victor Herbert, to write a score of operatic quality. That show was Naughty Marietta, which opened in 1910.
He had this chorus, all these opera singers. He had even an orchestra. He had to keep them employed. So Victor Herbert wrote Naughty Marietta for him, and we see Naughty Marietta. People who have seen it come out thinking, well, you know, there was a comedian in that, and he kept making jokes. I didn't know they had those in operetta. They had those in every musical up until, more or less, up until Hammerstein and Sondheim.
Set in New Orleans in the 1700s, Captain Dick and his infantry are searching for a pirate marauder. He meets Marietta, who has recently left France to avoid marrying a man she didn't love. Eventually, the pirate is captured and Dick and Marietta end up together. But Naughty Marietta had some of the most romantic songs ever written by Herbert.
Yes, I'm falling in love with someone plain to see. I'm sure I could love someone madly if someone would only love me. Oh, sweet mystery of life, at last I found thee. I know at last the secret of it all. All the longing, seeking, striving, waiting, yearning, the burning hopes, the joy and idle tears that fall. Sing, sing, zing, 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 boom, boom, eh. Sing, sing, zing, 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 mandolinas gay. Sing, sing, zing, 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 boom, boom, eh. Ah, ah, la, la, la. Sing, boom, eh. La, 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 la. Ah, ah. Sing, sing.
There's more to this story than the success of Naughty Marietta. Again, we turn to historian Miles Kreuger.
Victor Herbert mounted the podium for the last performance of Naughty Marietta, and in Act One, Emma Trentini came out to sing the Italian street song. This was a great moment in the American musical theater, and there was thunderous applause from the audience, which knew it would never again hear the star sing that song. And they obviously wanted an encore, and Herbert tapped the baton and indicated that he wanted an encore, and she wouldn't come back. She would not perform it, and he tapped again. She wouldn't come back, and he was enraged and insulted by this great slight from this Italian prima donna with whom he had been having nothing but trouble for 2 years. And he threw down the baton, stormed off the podium. The rest of the performance was conducted by the assistant, who I think was Gus Salzer. And he marched around to the back of the theater and said to Arthur Hammerstein and Otto Harbach, I will never write another note for that woman again, and he stormed out. Now they needed a new composer for The Firefly. And Otto Harbach had been corresponding with Hugo Felix, a very important European composer of operettas at the time. Gus Schirmer, the founder of the Schirmer publishing company, G. Schirmer's, had a man working for him as a demonstrator. Schirmer brought Arthur Hammerstein and Otto Harbach over to listen to this man who had never written one note ever for the theater. And they said, do you think you can write for the theater? And this man said, well, of course I can write for the theater. I mean, anybody can write for the theater. Listen to this. And he started tinkling away at the piano. Well, they finally thought, he's obviously phenomenally gifted. We'll just somehow train him for this new craft of writing for the theater. And so they engaged Rudolf Frimmel, who had never written one note for the theater, to compose the score for what turned out to be a smash hit in the winter of 1912, The Firefly, his very, very first show.
He was very tall, very exact in his movements and so on. But when he played that piano, it sounded like a cembalo. Real Hungarian cembalo.
Here from The Firefly is a sample of Frimmel's Giannina Mia. The Firefly became as big a hit as Naughty Marietta. Thus, in a most auspicious way, Herbert's refusal to write The Firefly launched Rudolf Frimmel on his operetta composing career. We must go back now to 1911, the year that introduced a new singing star to the theatrical world. The Schubert brothers opened their new theater on Broadway at 50th Street called the Winter Garden. The revue La Belle Paris introduced Al Jolson, who would soon become one of Broadway's most popular attractions. Like so many superstars, he was unlike anyone before or since. His special gift was a unique voice quality and an ability to entertain. Other European imports lit up the Broadway stage in this era to add to the operetta craze. We're all familiar with My Fair Lady, based on the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. However, the first Shaw play to become a musical was Arms and the Man. The musical version, called The Chocolate Soldier, was a satire on war which dealt with a pacifist who would rather eat chocolates than fight. A big hit in 1909, it still continues to be performed in regional theaters today. An example of the Oscar Strauss score is its most famous song, My Hero.
Come, come, I love you only, my heart is true. Come, come, my life is lonely, I long for you. Come, come, naught can efface you, my arms are aching now to embrace you. Thou art divine. Come, come, I love you only.
Victor Herbert continued to write popular fare. Outstanding among these was Sweethearts in 1913. The story told of a prince who falls in love with a commoner, this time the daughter of a laundress. But all ends happily when it is revealed that she is in reality a princess in disguise. Sweethearts did have a beautiful score, including Jeanette and her little wooden shoes, The Angelus, and the ever-popular Sweethearts.
Sweethearts make love their very own. Sweethearts can live on love alone. For them eyes where love quite lies, open the gates to paradise.
Our connection with Viennese operetta was through England, where they would first be translated from German into English and then brought over to America. However, The Viennese period was gradually coming to a close as war clouds gathered in Europe, where nationalism continued to grow. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand set off a chain of events that erupted into World War. With England at war with the German-Austrian-Hungarian alliance, the source for operetta dried up. Since our sentiments were with the English, even before we joined the war in 1917, anything Austrian or German became very unpopular. Now the American musical had to look to its own sources for new musical material. Ironically, in October of 1914, a British import would change the American musical theater and point the way to a true American style in music. It was called The Girl from Utah. Jerome Kern, an American composer, was hired to write some additional songs for the New York debut of this popular English musical.
Play a musical called The Girl from Utah, which again was nothing to do with Utah, it was about London. It was a girl who had come from Utah, so he went to London. But he started off interpolating some songs. This was an English show that was imported here, and by the time the show opened, I think he had some 7 songs
That's
in it.
right, and every single one of the hits was a current song. If you ever play the original score, and it's been published, it's pretty dull. You wonder why they even brought it over in the first
It was
place.
Paul Rubens, wasn't it?
Yes.
And he was a very, very successful British writer. And with that show, and the fact that one song in particular became very successful, that had been first sung in The Girl from Utah, and that was They Wouldn't Believe Me. And that, or They Didn't Believe Me. They didn't believe me.
Yeah.
And that became such a tremendous hit. And his first really big hit, he had done some other songs which had also been successful. But
Well,
this
that
was the
song
first-
changed the nature of musical comedy, too, and established musical comedy songwriting. Before that, the hit song was generally conceived of as a waltz in 3/4 time, certainly in any operetta. A little different in your musical comedies. But what They Didn't Believe Me, you had the advent of the 4/4 love ballad that became the standard up until very, very recently. And almost any song you introduced in the old shows would have been a 4/4 love ballad if they wanted it as a hit.
And when I told them how beautiful you are, they didn't believe me. They didn't believe me. Your lips, your eyes, your cheeks, your hair are in a class beyond compare. You're the loveliest boy that one could see. And when I tell them, and I'm certainly going to tell them, that I'm the man whose wife one day you'll be, they'll never believe me. They'll never believe me. That from this great big world you've chosen
You know, if you've read Alan J. Lerner's recent book on American musicals, he calls Kern the master. And the story of Gershwin is that he was at the wedding of an aunt,
Yes.
wasn't it? And kept hearing these...
You're Here and I'm Here? You're Here and I'm Here? Was
Well,
that
he,
the song?
no, he kept hearing, that was one of them,
Yeah.
but he kept hearing several numbers which were just so superior. He went up to the orchestra leader and said, "What in the world are you playing?" And the orchestra leader said, "It's the Kern interpolations from The Girl from Utah." Even Arthur Schwartz, every composer recognized
I think it's quite true.
Kern as the pivotal composer. Look, They Didn't Believe Me gave rise to the ballad which dominated the theater and all popular music for 50 years. He created modern musical comedy with his partners in the Princess Theater shows, and then he created the modern American musical play with the Showboat. He was constantly the great pioneer.
In 1914, Broadway welcomed Irving Berlin. a new composer who had previously made his mark in Tin Pan Alley. Berlin had taught himself to play the piano as a boy in the back room of a saloon where he worked on New York's Lower East Side. In 1911, he not only scored a nationwide hit with Alexander's Ragtime Band, he also crystallized a national craze for ragtime music.
And somebody else came along in 1914, and that was Irving Berlin, in a show called Watch Your Step. And that introduced ragtime to Broadway. So we had two different things being introduced to Broadway in the same year.
The Watch Your Step had a very famous credit, plot, if any, and was reviewed in many places as a review.
Irving Berlin's career in the theater, in Tin Pan Alley, and in films would cover 50-plus years and include romantic period pieces like Always, wrenching ballads like What'll I Do and All Alone, plus durable hits like Easter Parade, White Christmas, and God Bless America.
Irving Berlin is, tell you about Irving Berlin, it's in history what Irving Berlin, I can't tell you, don't have to tell you. He was responsible for all songwriters, theater, on theater, to be a thing called the popular song. Berlin is the one of a kind, you know, he's the Bach of so-called popular music.
Irving Berlin is probably the one composer in the theater most closely associated with popular music, and yet his theater scores would rate with the best Broadway has ever heard. Summing up 1914, there were a lot of firsts for Broadway.
But in effect, you had the first plotless review, in short, the review as you know it today, the first modern love ballad, and the introduction of a full ragtime score. There were ragtime numbers earlier, of course, but this was the first full, and virtually the only ragtime score.
Play a simple melody, not only introduce ragtime, but counterpoint.
1915 brought about more changes. The Ziegfeld Follies moved to the New Amsterdam Theater and established itself as the most opulent and beautiful production on Broadway. Florence Ziegfeld's personal secretary, Goldie Clow, describes the Follies.
The Ziegfeld Follies consisted of sketches, you know what I mean by sketches, dance routines, ballets, all the comedy things, the beautiful girls parading across the stage.
And the girls were gorgeous. They were really spectacular and spectacularly dressed with feathers and plumes and all kinds of coming down staircases.
In between each girl number, there would be a comedy sketch. Nothing dramatic, you know, just funny. And there was Bill Fields, W.C. Fields, and Will Rogers, and Fanny Bryce, and little Ray Dooley, the Dooley brothers.
Much of this was due to Joseph Urban's breathtaking settings. For the first time, an overall color scheme was used for the sets, creating a single look for the entire show.
Of course, Urban was Viennese. He was a fine architect, illustrated children's books. He was very diversified. But you must remember, he came at the tail end of a time when what we would call set designers today were called scene painters. And the point is, they painted tremendously realistic pictures on the flats. And there are books showing sets from the Ziegfeld Follies with the most minutely detailed recreations of, say, London viewed from a Zeppelin, or a magnificent French garden. The sort of thing that we wouldn't have the time or the money to do today. Today we just hint at it.
Designer Joseph Urban would remain with Ziegfeld for the next 15 years. In the 1915 Follies, Ziegfeld introduced several performers who would become Broadway favorites: W.C. Fields, Ed Wynn, Ina Claire, Ann Pennington, and George White. It's important to note that no one was ever starred in the Ziegfeld Follies.
He usually had other people, Gene Buck perhaps, one of his assistants, who would go out and get the comic people. The discovery of Fanny Brice was not made, I believe, by Ziegfeld, but by an assistant of his, and Ziegfeld went along with it as soon as the man said, yes, we should hire her, she's very good. So they did. W.C. Fields had a very famous pool table routine, which he did in pantomime. And one time, he did this routine, and he couldn't understand it because the audience was laughing in all the wrong places. Well, he suddenly looked down underneath the pool table, and there was Ed Wynn making faces. So he conked Ed Wynn with his cue, and practically knocked Ed Wynn out. I don't know if that was done in New York or in Boston, but at least that was that was done. And for a time, because Fields would never speak to Wynn at all because he was trying to ruin his act. But
none of us here are old enough to have ever seen one of the great Follies. I saw one, but it was long after Ziegfeld was dead and was produced by the Schuberts. It's interesting to me that the most Brahmin of all your drama critics in Ziegfeld's day, George G. Nathan, though he poo-pooed most everything on Broadway, insisted that Ziegfeld had elevated what was nothing but essentially cheap burlesque into an art form. And I think when a man like that thinks there was something to it, there must have been.
The Princess Theater was a small 299-seat house located on West 39th Street. Since popular musicals of the day were all large costume and set shows with huge casts, it was difficult to find shows that would be profitable in such a small house. The owners got the idea to try new, smaller musicals with only one set per act and without large choruses. Jerome Kern was asked to write the scores, and Guy Bolton was asked to write the books.
The Princess Theater shows were essentially a breakthrough. Not a really dramatic departure, but a rather important, I want to call it an evolution. It was a case of bringing out things that were already there. His music was not really that different from the songs he had written 2 or 3 years earlier. The librettos were not all that different. The staging was not all that different, and yet they were, because they wanted everything to come together as a unit. The word that we use today was to integrate, and that's what they were doing. That's what wasn't done at that time. You had the same cornball jokes. You had the same caricatures as characters, but at least they all related to the story. And the music or the songs related to the plot. And they tried to retain the tone when they were doing the stage sets and the dances. The Princess Theater shows all opened at the Princess, and the minute they were a hit, they were moved, because first of all, you couldn't get in, and the demand was so great. And generally speaking, within 2 or 3 months, they were moved to the casino right down the street or to some other full-size house.
There was a Princess Theater show that didn't even open at the Princess, and that was Leave It to Jane, because Oh Boy was running at the Princess, was doing so well that they decided they'd have to open it at a larger theater.
The first Princess show was not a hit, but later in the year, their second attempt, Very Good Eddie, was a smash. The story concerned 2 honeymooning couples on a cruise up the Hudson River and centered around their romantic marital mix-ups. For Oh Boy, P.G. Wodehouse would provide the lyrics and collaborate with Kern and Bolton.
In the original Oh Boy, they had a song called I Want to Be an Old-Fashioned Wife. All the chorus girls ran off stage and ran back on, each carrying a rocking chair. And they all plunked themselves into the rocking chair and started to knit as they sang that. Well, you couldn't get away with that today. That would be pure camp. But in those days, it was considered stylish and clever and integrated into the sophistication of the show.
Also, these shows had fairly large casts.
Yes.
I mean, today, we would consider they would have a cast as large as Cats, I'm sure. They had large choruses. They had large areas backstage, I think, not so much on stage. And another thing that they did to help out with this intimacy of these shows was to have a certain, there was a rule about the number of sets that they would use, because they didn't have that
One
much
per
room
act.
to fly them. So there was one set per act, and I think one was always repeated. One interesting thing about those shows to me is the fact that I think a lot of this humor, now remember, these shows are written not just by Jerome Kern, who wrote the music, but they had librettos by P.G. Wodehouse and Guy Bolton, and lyrics by P.G. Wodehouse. And I think that there was a lot of the British musical theater in these shows. You had the humor, which was typically Wodehouse and typically British. And it's interesting that those shows are considered to be the earliest examples of American musical comedy. Leave It to Jane was about college, was about football, and this added another element in musical theater. I guess this was an attempt to become really American as far as P.G. Wodehouse was concerned.
While the Princess shows were running on Broadway, the country was being drawn into the conflict raging in Europe. On April 7, 1916, the United States declared war on Germany. Sentiment for things Austrian and German had totally disappeared. Back home, Al Jolson would continue to be one of the biggest draws on Broadway in his shows at the Winter Garden, Robinson Crusoe Jr. in 1916 and Sinbad in 1918. In the latter, he introduced such favorites as Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody and My Mammy. Swanee by George Gershwin would be added to Sinbad after the show left Broadway for a tour. It was this song that made George Gershwin famous overnight. And even though his first show, La La Lucille in 1919, would not be a major hit, his reputation as a top songwriter would be well established. With Maytime in 1917, Sigmund Romberg firmly established himself as the new operetta king. A Hungarian immigrant, Romberg had his first hit with an Austrian import, The Blue Paradise, in 1915. Broadway conductor Jay Blackton gives us a portrait of Sigmund Romberg.
Romberg was quite a jolly man, very jolly. He played piano like a Hungarian with all of the frills that they wanted, the cembalo. He really was a very fine pianist, but in that kind of very highly technical, florid style. In fact, I remember when we first met, he was trying out a new song that he had written, and he played it for me. And he finished with a flourish, and he turned to me and said, "How you like it? Sounds like Tchaikovsky, no?" So even the great ones borrow from the others, you know.
Although it was based on a Viennese piece, Maytime had an entirely new score, and because we were at war with Germany, the show was set in America. In his book, American Musical Theater, Gerald Boardman says, and I quote, "So virulent the anti-German emotions that the source of the story was never mentioned on the work's program or sheet music."
Maytime opened right at the height of America's involvement with World War I, and anything that suggested Vienna and the Viennese world, of course, was forbidden because we were at war with them. The great appeal of this show was that it depicted New York City in the early days when life was simpler and life was very romantic. It was an extremely idyllic vision of New York City in the early days. It's a story of a young girl named Ottilie who is well-born, and at the end of Act One, her father sends her suitor off packing because he isn't good enough for Ottilie. And they spend the next two acts getting together, but not themselves. They get together through their grandchildren, who ultimately find the happiness that they were denied in Act One. And the leitmotif, in a sense, that runs through the show is the song "Will You Remember," which most people think of as "Sweetheart, Sweetheart." And the show, of course, helped to make a tremendous star of Peggy Wood, and Charles Purcell was the original leading man. But the interesting thing was that the show was so successful because it depicted the happy days, the carefree days of New York City prior to World War I, that audiences flocked to it. And they had to open a second company across the street from the first company, and it's the only time, to my knowledge, in the history of Broadway when two companies of the same Broadway musical were playing simultaneously across the street from each other, and both were packed. And in some sense, it served exactly the same emotional needs to its World War I audiences that Oklahoma served to the audiences of World War II.
While we were still at war, Irving Berlin was commissioned to write the music for an Army review, Yip Yip Yap Hank. He not only wrote it, but appeared in it, singing his own hit song, Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning. The armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, thus ending World War I, and Broadway celebrated with a banner year. The Ziegfeld Follies of 1919 was considered by many to be the best in the whole history of the Follies. In it, Irving Berlin's A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody became the quintessential showgirl song. The biggest hit of the year, however, was a book musical, Irene. It was the story of a poor Irish upholsterer from Hell's Kitchen who falls in love with a wealthy man when she is summoned to his Long Island home to repair some pillows. Related to the Princess shows because of its simple story with believable people, the popularity of Edith Day and the lovely score by Harry Tierney and Joseph McCarthy proved irresistible to the public. Irene lasted over 600 performances and was successfully revived in 1973 with Debbie Reynolds in the title role. With the decade drawing to a close, the war to end all wars behind them, America was ready to take its place as a world leader. The Broadway musical had begun to create its own special place in theater history. 1920 arrived with new talent standing in the wings, ready with energy and optimism. As we've said before, the musical theater cannot be viewed at any time out of its historical context. This was never more true than during the period of the 20s and 30s. The atmosphere of carefree abandon following the war would greatly affect Broadway. Following World War I, there were several abrupt changes in American life that were reflected in the theater. In 1920, the war to end all wars was over. Women got the vote, and Prohibition had become the law. Prohibition, which outlawed alcoholic beverages, came as a constitutional amendment. Its unpopularity was obvious from the start. Alcohol simply went underground. People either made liquor, beer, and wine at home or ordered directly from their bootlegger. They also went to places called speakeasies. Those were bars with locked doors, entry to which was granted when members gave the password. Disregard for prohibition became so widespread that law enforcement could do little to stop it. The illegality of the situation merely added to the excitement of the era. Women soon enjoyed other freedoms. In a speakeasy, it became acceptable for women to drink and smoke in public. With their illicit atmosphere, speakeasies gave an air of permissiveness to all society. Hemlines were going up, and inhibitions were going down. The new music sweeping the country, eclipsing ragtime, was jazz, with its wild, fast, and shocking beat. All of this was reflected in the theater of the early 20s. Despite some economic variations after the war, there was enough money around to give the country a feeling of fiscal abandon. Audiences didn't seem to care how they spent their money. They just enjoyed themselves. Enter the era of reviews. The annual Ziegfeld Follies were well established by 1920. The stars, the costumes, the sets were all the best.
And the costuming that he had, he would not settle for anything less than the finest in materials that his showgirls wore. And he was, of course, very adept at choosing the showgirls. That was his great specialty. He was not considered to be too knowledgeable about the comedians. Oh, Will Rogers, I forgot to mention, yes, too, who was in a number of the Ziegfeld Follies.
Ziegfeld always had class. He really was a man of great taste. So what he could do could be very sensualistic, and yet, as they say, in the best of taste, he got away with nudity in his shows, which some of the Ziegfeld Follies had nude tableaus, yeah. But a few years after that, in the 20s, there was a clampdown on all kinds of things in theater. Even important plays were closed by the authorities, but Ziegfeld got away with it because he had suave.
There were many other imitators of the Follies. None outdid them, but the George White scandals and Earl Carroll vanities came closest. George White began his career as a dancer, working mainly for Ziegfeld. But in 1920, he branched out on his own. His scandals would concentrate more on dancing, but they had their share of comedy and spectacle. Earl Carroll vanities had more undraped girls and censorable humor. The passing shows put on by the Schuberts at the Winter Garden imitated Ziegfeld's follies, but were generally a shoddy third behind George White and Earl Carroll. At the bottom of the list, there were revues with off-color jokes and girls in some state of undress, surrounded by loud, jazzy music and dancing, and anything else the producers could throw on the stage. The titles of some of these shows suggest their content. Bunk of 1926, Great Temptations, Bare Facts of 1926, Knicks-Knacks of 26, and Padlocks of 27. In 1923, the Charleston was introduced with an all-Negro revue called Runnin' Wild. The Charleston was so popular, it became synonymous with the 20s, exemplifying the frenetic tempo of the era. There were revues that offered taste and quality. Irving Berlin, already a wealthy man by 1921, along with producer Sam Harris, built the Music Box Theater as a showcase for his Music Box Revue. They produced 4 editions of this annual revue. The theme song for all these shows was Berlin's Say It With Music. An English import, André Charlot's Revue of 1924, introduced the intimate, sophisticated revue. It starred Beatrice Lillie, Gertrude Lawrence, and Jack Buchanan, 3 London performers who would be heard from again in subsequent Broadway shows. Charlot's Revue showed that an evening's entertainment could involve the mind as well as the eye, the ear, and the funny bone. While revues were popular, book musicals were not forgotten in the early 20s. And if Jerome Kern needed anything to cement his position as the leader in the field of musical comedy composers, Sally in 1920 was that necessary hit. Sally was written specifically for Ziegfeld's biggest star in 1920, petite dancer Marilyn Miller.
She was a tap dancer as well as a ballet dancer. She may not have been the greatest in the world, but she had a great deal of charm and a great deal of flair, and she was a beautiful girl. She was blonde, and people did find her very, very attractive. She did not have a particularly good singing voice, and she appeared in a number of these revues.
Marilyn Miller was a totally traditional dancer. All the cute little mincing toe steps and the flutterings that you expected, almost going back again to the 19th century. She broke no new ground, whereas the Astairs were willing to be totally contemporary.
She was a beautiful dancer, a toe dancer, and she sang beautifully, was beautiful, looked very much, as I remember, like Marilyn Monroe. And she was very dainty and very lovely.
Marilyn Miller was the last, I think, of the old-fashioned heroines. She was not a good singer, but what voice was there was soprano. It was very, very high. She made 3 movies, and they're all still, they still survive. And if you listen to the soundtracks, you don't even have to see the movies, just listen to the voice, you think, my God, that's awful. This was the elfin beauty who captivated all Broadway. She was the toast of the town from about, I guess the 20s was her heyday, till 1933, her last show. She was regarded as the absolute guaranteed sellout. She was Ziegfeld's favorite. They had not only a great professional collaboration, they had a very hot love affair. And that might have been the love of his life, in fact, Marilyn Miller. She was very, 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 I don't know what the word is. It was not so much that she was beautiful, not so much that she was talented. She certainly couldn't sing. She was a great dancer, for sure. But she just had something. There was something very enchanting about her on stage in those big theaters.
The story of Sally is typical of the musicals of the 20s and owes a lot to the Princess Theater shows and to Irene. Sally first appears as a dishwashing drudge at the Alley Inn in Greenwich Village, dreaming of fame and singing, "Look for the Silver Lining." She's invited by one of the waiters, really the exiled Duke of Czechoslovakia, played by Leon Errol. Sally goes to an elegant ball in the guise of Madame Nukarova, a celebrated ballerina. In Irene fashion, her true identity is discovered. But here the heroine not only wins the affluent young tenor, she's also signed for the Ziegfeld Follies and dances a butterfly ballet by Victor Herbert. The last scene finds all the principals heading for their own triple wedding at the little church around the corner.
If you look back to Marilyn Miller, who is this blonde America's sweetheart, I mean, she's like Mary Pickford. She's Mary Pickford in musical comedy. Then you look at not only Merman, but Cheetah Rivera, Gwen Verdon, you see an incredible change in type. I don't just mean a change in coloring. I mean, we have just completely, much stronger, much more working class, even ethnic people coming forth to play leads. The musicals have changed completely. In fact, if Marilyn Miller came back, so to say, and with a better voice, I don't know if they could, what would they do, revive Sally for her? Another Ziegfeld show and another extremely old-fashioned, each part is there. You have the girls, you have the star shots, you have, this is going to be a hit song, let's do it. I mean, it's an integrated show. It's a Jerome Kern show, and it's not a Hammerstein show, but it's a serious attempt, even in 1920, to tell a story sincerely. But it's got its little extraneous things. If you could get a cast album of that show and listen to the songs in order, you wouldn't know what on earth that show was about.
In 1925, Kern would again write a vehicle for Marilyn Miller called Sonny, this time with Oscar Hammerstein and Otto Harbach. It, too, would be a popular vehicle, and Miss Miller would receive the highest salary of any star in the 20s, a reputed $3,000 per week. Let's retrace our steps back to 1921 and Sigmund Romberg. A big hit in London, Lilac Time, based on a fictional biography of composer Franz Schubert, was being readied for its New York opening. Retitled Blossom Time, the songs were taken from melodies by Schubert. The American producers were unhappy with the English score, and they asked Romberg to readapt the Schubert melodies. Although he was unhappy about adapting another composer's work, he was in need of money, so he accepted the task, and Blossom Time turned out to be one of the most successful operettas ever written. It played over 500 performances in New York, had 4 touring companies, and 5 subsequent revivals in New York. Surprisingly, Romberg was still not a household name, and he would continue in relative obscurity until 1924, when The Student Prince would become the longest-running show of the 20s. With songs like Golden Days, The Drinking Song, and Deep in My Heart, The Student Prince is still one of our most popular musicals. Romberg and the show's producers, the Schubert brothers, were at odds during the production of this operetta. The Schuberts thought the score too operatic, hated the unhappy ending, and didn't like the idea of a large male chorus instead of the usual bevy of girls. But Romberg prevailed, and not only was the show the longest-running musical to open during the 20s, with over 600 performances, no less than 9 touring companies were required to fill the demand throughout the country. 2 years later, Romberg's The Desert Song, based loosely on the conflict between the French and the Berbers in Morocco, captivated Broadway. In it, the romantic Red Shadow, dressed in a red mask and cape, leads his men in battle and finds time to woo the beautiful Margot, the daughter of the French military commander. It starred Vivian Siegel, who had made her debut in Romberg's The Blue Paradise back in 1915.
Well, Vivian Siegel is much more standard issue. Charming, though I know she was an operetta-type person. She was a good comedian, so when operetta died out, she could play comedian parts in real musical comedy, but she had a trained voice. She was attractive, very musical. She was the kind of person you would never be out of work on Broadway in those days.
In case you hadn't noticed, by the mid-20s, the American operetta was a major musical form. 3 months before The Student Prince opened in 1924, Rudolf Frimmel, who gave us The Firefly, teamed up with Oscar Hammerstein and Otto Harbach to give us Rose Marie. Oscar Hammerstein's son, William, tells us that Otto Harbach trained Oscar Hammerstein as a librettist.
He was a kind of protege of Otto's, and he idolized him and respected him, and all his life gave credit to Otto for instilling in him the desire to constantly improve his craft.
Rose Marie was the top-grossing musical of the decade. Set in Canada, it told of the love of a French-Canadian girl and a gold prospector falsely accused of murder. There are Mounties in snappy red uniforms, Indians, and totem poles, which encase the girls of the chorus for the Totem Tom Tom number. Rudolf Frimmel composed some of his best music for Rose Marie, especially the Indian Love Call and the title song, Rose Marie. It was billed as a musical play because Hammerstein and Harbach tried to integrate the songs and dialogue. As a matter of fact, they said in the program, and I quote, "The musical numbers in this play are such an integral part of the action that we do not think we should list them as separate episodes." Then they do list 4 of the songs. William Hammerstein's account would seem to refute these lofty ideals.
Rosemarie, I think, is the first show, it may be the first show I ever saw. I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I can remember sitting in the box that overlooked the stage. And in Rosemarie, the girls sang a song at some point called We Have Something for You. And on opening night, my uncle had produced it. My father's uncle, Arthur, had produced it. I mean, we've been in the theater a long time, our family. And it was Prohibition. So Arthur, being a clever publicist, had small bottles of champagne, and the girls would sing this song, We Have Something for You, and they'd throw the little bottles out to the audience, which, of course, forced the New York administration to put him in jail, and all the girls who would handle the champagne, they had to go to jail. Well, wow, front pages, wonderful thing. But then after that, they threw little boxes of raisins. So they would throw boxes of, they knew the author's son was up there in the box, this little kid, and they'd throw raisins up there. I can remember those things.
The following year, 1925, Frimmel unveiled The Vagabond King. Originally, producer Russell Janney planned this operetta to have a score by the youthful team of Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart, who had already transformed the novel and play If I Were King into an amateur musical. When he was unable to get financial backing, however, Janney turned to the more experienced team of Rudolph Frimmel and Brian Hooker. Based on a fanciful tale involving the poet Francois Villon, it told of a handsome scoundrel who was made King of France for a day. Leading his rabble of low degree, he drives the invading Burgundy army from Paris and wins the hand of a noblewoman. The score was very popular, with Song of the Vagabonds, Someday, and Only a Rose, which are still performed today. Operetta reached its zenith in the 20s. Meanwhile, other composers were writing musical comedies in the vein of Sally and Sonny. George Gershwin became famous when he wrote Swanee in 1919. But when he teamed with his brother Ira, their theater scores carved a special niche in the musical theater history.
Gershwin was hired to write the scores for the earliest of these George White scandals. There was not too much music in those shows, as I remember. Maybe there may have been 6, 7, or 8 songs in them. Not that great number of songs. But Gershwin was able to break out of the review mold, because people thought of reviews as a stepping stone, because all they had to do was concentrate on individual songs. When they hit book shows, they were supposed to make sure that these songs in some way had something to do with a plot. And so Gershwin and his brother Ira wrote their first plot musical, which is 1924, called Lady Be Good. And it's had the Fred and Adele Astaire were the leading people in it, and they were a captivating duo. They at the time, early in their career, Adele, who was about a year older than Fred, was considered the better dancer. And
she was also considered a great comedian. There was many a contemporary review that compared her to be Lily.
They were adorable. Of course, Adele was she was a great friend of mine, too. She remained so full of life. She was very different from Fred. She was full of fun and she was not a clown, but she was very full of life, where he was more sedate, and they were wonderful together. And of course, when she married, you wondered what was going to happen to him, and look what happened to him.
While the story about a vaudeville team who are dispossessed and continue their singing and dancing in the homes of friends doesn't bear repeating, Lady Be Good had a wonderful score, including the title song Lady Be Good and Fascinating Rhythm. The original score also contained The Man I Love, but it was dropped from the show during the pre-Broadway tryout.
Gershwin and the Astaires had something in common. They were considered, certainly in the 20s and the early 30s, to be in the vanguard of a what you might call intellectualized popular art. They were the people who were taking popular entertainment where it was going to go. You can compare them, for example, compare Gershwin and his brother to De Silva, Brown, and Henderson, who were simply recreating what the public wanted at the time, who were sort of the middle brow or low brow. Gershwin's were, even very early, wasn't it 1922, Stanley, that he had that miniature opera in
135th
Scandals,
Street.
and they had to drop it out.
They had to drop it.
1922, the man was only 24 years old, and they were already pushing the boundaries of popular art.
In 1926, the Gershwins were back on Broadway with OK. This time in collaboration with Guy Bolton and P.G. Woodhouse of Princess Theater fame. It starred Gertrude Lawrence, fresh from her triumph in 2 Charlot revues, who would become one of the musical theater's greatest stars.
Lawrence, however, was unique. She really was unique, even though she was very difficult to get along with personally. And I understand that very irregular in her habits on stage, so that you never knew from night to night. You speak about performances being different. It depends on what you saw. You know, were you there Friday? Were you there Wednesday? Were you there for revival? She never played any given role the same way from night to night. You know, one night she'd enter this way, and everyone would be looking there. The next night, no, she'd come from behind them. She was very impetuous, but this came through very spontaneous talent, and I think that's what made her so magical.
OK's score was vintage Gershwin. At one point in the musical, Gertrude Lawrence, posing as a maid, curls up on the corner of a sofa and sings "Someone to Watch Over Me" to a doll. The score also contained 3 more big Gershwin tunes: Maybe, Do, Do, Do What You Done, Done, Done Before, and Clap Your Hands. Once more, we retrace our steps, this time back to 1921, and the first black musical after World War I. Based on a vaudeville sketch, Shuffle Along became the first successful musical written and directed and acted by black people. Opening in 1921 at a dilapidated theater north of the theater district, the show soon caught on with the Broadway and society crowd, ending its run with an astonishing 504 performances. The team of Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles had the leading roles, and the team of Eubie Blake and Noble Sissel supplied the infectious songs. Among them was this campaign song of a candidate for the mayor of Jimtown, USA, entitled "I'm Just Wild About Harry." In 1928, and again in 1932 and 52, they would again try to do new versions of Shuffle Along. All 3 times they would prove unsuccessful. Earlier, I mentioned Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart when they were replaced by Rudolph Frimmel and Brian Hooker as composer team for The Vagabond King. One of the most important musical collaborations in the 20s and 30s, Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart were both native New Yorkers. Rodgers was encouraged by his father, a medical doctor, to follow a musical career. He was introduced to Larry Hart by a mutual friend who thought they would work well together. What was Larry Hart like? Well, here is Richard Rodgers' daughter, Mary, to tell us about Lorenz Hart.
Larry was tiny, and I never could understand when I was very young why it was that he was older than my father when he was shorter. That, as a small child, people are shorter or younger. He had the most generous nature in the world. He always gave presents, and one year he gave us all watches, which I thought was the most wildly luxurious thing that ever happened in my life. He was a darling, warm-hearted, very unhappy man.
Rodgers' clean musical line and Hart's incredibly clever and often stinging lyrics had never been equaled. Producers were reluctant to trust them with a score because of their youth, and for the first 5 years of their collaboration, they had to be content with just writing amateur shows.
Rodgers actually began when he was even younger than George Gershwin, and he had his first breakthrough was in 1925, although he did have a show in 1919 called Poor Little Ritz Girl. And he and Larry Hart became, I think, the first composer-lyricist team to be associated as a team. If you look at the sheet music of the Gershwin shows, you'll find that Gershwin's name was always printed in larger letters than his brother Ira's name. Or I think Kern and Hammerstein. Kern's name was in larger letters. But with Rodgers and Hart, you never thought of them as anything else but Rodgers and Hart. They were a team.
In 1925, Rodgers was about to give up writing altogether when the Theater Guild hired the team for a benefit show to help raise money for tapestries at the Guild's newly erected Guild Theater. Since they performed the review at the Garrick Theater, they called it the Garrick Gaieties. The Gaieties became so popular that it was given a regular run at the theater and remained for 6 months. Rodgers' gift for melody and Hart's skill at unusual internal rhymes was personified by the hit song from the show, Manhattan. Rodgers and Hart were off and running. Their next show, Dearest Enemy, was the first of 8 book musicals written together with librettist Herbert Fields. Set in 1776 during the American Revolution, it tells how some ladies managed to divert British troops long enough for General Putnam to link up his forces with George Washington. Discovering her swimming in the nude, here we see the show's heroine, Helen Ford, keeping Charles Purcell at bay with an umbrella as he tries to return her shoe. The score contained the Rodgers and Hart standard, Here in My Arms. Rodgers and Hart were not only good, they were also prolific, turning out 14 shows between 1925 and 1930. We'll hear more from them later. The 20s were rich with new talent bursting on the Broadway scene. Despite the success of Jerome Kern, the Gershwins, and Rodgers and Hart, the music of Vincent Youmans, more than any of his contemporaries, epitomized the musicals of the 20s. He would be forced to retire in 1933 due to tuberculosis, but in his relatively short career, he wrote some of the most popular musicals of the day. Born to a wealthy family, Youmans set out to be an engineer. However, after he wrote his first song for a Navy show, he opted for a career in the theater. As a song plugger and as a rehearsal pianist for Victor Herbert, he became friends with George Gershwin. In fact, his first musical score for Two Little Girls in Blue came about because George Gershwin suggested his name to the show's producer. However, it was his next show, Wildflower, written with Oscar Hammerstein II and Otto Harbach, that established his career. Then along came the hugely popular No No Nanette. It was all about a lady Nanette and her guardian uncle, a philandering married Bible publisher, trying to keep his 3 lady friends from finding out about each other. The final scene is in Atlantic City, where, of course, they all end up together. The score contains some of Youmans' best songs, including Tea for Two and I Want to Be Happy. It was probably the most internationally popular show of the 20s, but it was also the quintessential example of the kind of song and dance shows of that period. As we mentioned earlier, Irving Berlin built his own theater for his music box reviews, of which there were 4 editions, 1924 being the last. But in 1925, again with producer Sam Harris, he returned to musical comedy, this time starring the zany Marx Brothers in Coconuts. As might be expected, it offered a gag-filled, loosely constructed spree in which the madcap team was allowed enough room to improvise and add new routines at their leisure. It was so successful that in 1929, it became the first Marx Brothers full-length movie. So, by 1926, there's lots of action at the box office. Broadway mainly consisted of elaborate revues, operettas, and mindless plot musical comedies. What happens next is astounding. 1927 will introduce the first grown-up American musical, a production which correctly deserves the title musical theater. 1927 was a very good year. 7 very important shows would be produced, representing most of the writing talent of the decade. The upward spiral of the economy seemed to be endless. Money to produce Broadway shows was easier to come by. Audiences also had enough money to keep those shows running.
We're talking now about the 1927-28 season, which was probably the greatest season in Broadway history. There were something like 260 plays produced on Broadway that year. There were over 50 musicals. And the musicals from that year included Good News, My Maryland, A Connecticut Yankee, Rosalie, Funny Face, Blackbirds, Showboat, of course.
In retrospect, we know that October of 1929 and the Wall Street crash was just around the corner. But in 1927, no one believed that prosperity wouldn't go on forever. Despite the public's flagging interest in his follies, Florence Ziegfeld's primary concern in 27 was the inauguration of the new Ziegfeld Theater, which would house his new book show, Rio Rita.
you're too young, I guess, to have seen the Ziegfeld Theater. Just to have walked into that, you got a feeling of how magnificent it was, how beautiful, what unusual colors, the sense of spaciousness, and the imagination in there. To me, there was no theater on Broadway like it.
Entirely designed by Joseph Urban, the theater was the epitome of all that Ziegfeld stood for. The lobby and lounges were palatial and more beautiful than any other theater in New York. The auditorium, shaped in a huge oval, had no box seats, just one continuous curved wall with a giant mural, also by Urban, painted in gold and black. The first musical to be housed in the Ziegfeld, Rio Rita, was sumptuously mounted. Opening night was especially grand.
It was the most glamorous thing you ever saw. Of course, I was always in charge of the first night tickets. And the place was filled with big stars, with celebrities, with diamonds coming in there, the emeralds, the rubies. I mean, it was just out of this world. Anybody who was anybody was there. About the only one who wasn't was the President of the United States, who never came to an opening night. But outside of that, there was just everybody.
The story, similar to Naughty Marietta and Rose Marie, was about a lawman chasing an outlaw, this time into Mexico, where he falls in love with a senorita.
It was a beautiful show. It was full of gorgeous girls. It had one of those silly plots, you know, that they did the musicals. Although nobody cared anything about plots in those days. That wasn't important. It was the music and the dancing that they really cared about. The story didn't matter.
The music by Harry Tierney and Joe McCarthy, both of Irene fame, pleased the audience with better than average musical numbers. Rio Rita ran for 499 performances. In April, Vincent Youmans, who brought us No No Nanette, was back with Hit the Deck. It contained two of his best songs, Hallelujah and Sometimes I'm Happy. Its storyline about a wealthy girl who follows a sailor around the world until she wins him was serviceable enough to support his exceptional score. Hit the Deck plowed no new ground, but audiences came to 352 performances for the entertainment it provided. The Ziegfeld Follies that August was the most expensive to date, $289,000. By comparison to cost today, it would represent a figure many times that size. The expenses, due in part to Urban's elaborate sets, but also to Ziegfeld's extravagant ways, were never recouped.
The sets would come on. Joseph Urban would design the sets, and we'd have a rehearsal of the sets. And there'd be one little thing in that set that he didn't like. And he'd call Joseph Urban and say, I don't like that, that's terrible. And Joseph would say, well, I'll take it out. No, throw the whole set out. Do it over. And that set would probably have cost $50,000, if not more. Maybe Eddie Cantor did something the night before. Maybe he changed a word or something in the script. Mr. Ziegfeld would write him a 20-page letter in longhand, and I can show you his handwriting in there. Nobody could read it. He'd write him a 20-page letter, send it down by chauffeur, in the Rolls Royce, by the chauffeur to the theater to make sure Eddie got it. Then he'd call me from Hastings and dictate another 30-page letter. Then he'd send Eddie a telegram that was maybe 10 or 12 pages long, and talk about being in debt when he died. I think we owed Western Union about $50,000, if not more. We never paid the bill.
The De Silva, Brown, and Henderson entry in 1927, Good News, could vie with No No Nanette as the typical musical of the 20s. Set in mythical Tate College, it opened with the collegiately dressed band running down the aisle to the orchestra pit, shouting college cheers. The story is about a football player who will be unable to play in the big game unless he passes his astronomy test. Aided by a co-ed who eventually ends up as his girl, he passes the test and wins the game. The real good news was the score, which contained The Best Things in Life Are Free and The Varsity Drag. By this time, Rodgers and Hart were enjoying success after success. Adapting Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, they scored their biggest hit of the 20s. Running for over a year, A Connecticut Yankee starred William Gaxton as an about-to-be-married man who gets knocked on the head and dreams he's back in King Arthur's court. Much of the humor centered around the knights and ladies of the court, picking up Gaxton's 20th century slang. The score was one of Rodgers and Hart's best, including Thou Swell and My Heart Stood Still. It was revived in 1943. That same November, the Gershwin brothers, George and Ira, brought back Fred and Adele Astaire in Funny Face. The story was negligible, but the score was one of Gershwin's most enduring. In High Hat, Fred Astaire, in white tie and tails, taps in front of a similarly dressed chorus of men who imitate his every step. Ira Gershwin's special gift for lyric shorthand is displayed in his use of his own contraction for "it is" in "Swonderful." With the possible exception of A Connecticut Yankee, the stories were derivative of a host of shows that had gone before. Then suddenly, we are treated to a realistic, serious musical drama filled with carefully drawn three-dimensional characters who interact within a plausible story about life on the Mississippi River. Even stranger, this serious musical drama would be produced by Florence Ziegfeld. This show, of course, was Showboat, based on Edna Ferber's novel by the same name. Miles Kreuger of the Institute of the American Musical has written an entire book on this one show and is its foremost authority.
Of course, Showboat was a landmark in the American musical theater for many, many reasons. To begin with, no musical had ever been written with so much care. Shows in those days tended to be written in 2 months at the most, and it was quite common for a composer or a librettist to have multiple shows on Broadway in any given season because they would just crank them out like so many television episodes in a sitcom. However, Jerome Kern fell in love with the book Showboat, bought the rights, brought Oscar Hammerstein into the project, and this was the very first time that Oscar Hammerstein had ever written the libretto for a show alone. Up to that time, all his earlier librettos were written in collaboration with his mentor, Otto Harbach. And Ziegfeld was introduced to the project and agreed to produce it, but with certain misgiving, because Ziegfeld really was associated with shows of a much more superficial nature than Showboat. Shows that featured lots of comedians like Leon Errol and Louis XIV or W.C. Fields, people like that. The idea of Showboat, a serious study of early America, was something really quite alien to Flo Ziegfeld. But he sensed the quality of the work, and so he agreed to produce it and present it at the Ziegfeld Theater, following Rio Rita, which was to open the theater. Now, Showboat is revolutionary in many ways, not only in the care in which it was created, but because it deals with an entire historical epoch in the American musical theater, in America rather. It starts right after the Civil War, and it goes right up to what was then the present, 1927. So it has a tremendous chronological span encompassed within it. Secondly, it takes its characters very seriously. Characters in musicals up to that time were either romantic or they were comic, and there were variations on both of those categories, but by and large, these weren't people to be taken seriously the way you would take a character in a drama seriously. But they have real human problems in Showboat. We have the problem of the protagonist, for example, Magnolia, who is a young girl protected from the realities of life by living on an island, a floating island, if you will, a showboat that doesn't even touch land except to perform shows. A woman who lives and grows up in a dream world where everything she knows about life, all her values, are the values that are presented in the melodramas that are enacted on the stages of the showboat itself. And she falls in love, leaves the showboat, leaves this protective cocoon, and goes to Chicago, is left by her gambling, ne'er-do-well husband. She has to raise a child in an expensive convent school, and so she resorts to the only thing that she knows how to do, perform, and she becomes a singer in nightclubs, and ultimately a star. Now, we're dealing with very serious problems. A woman alone, having to learn how to work and survive in Chicago in a hostile environment at the turn of the century. Very daring, Very, very daring. And Magnolia, as a character, is the first character in the entire literature of the American musical theater who grows and matures before the audience's eyes in the same way that a character in a drama might do so. Number two, we come to the problem of miscegenation, a forbidden subject in any area of theater normally. Very, very few plays ever dealt seriously with miscegenation. But in Showboat, we have the character of Julie, who is a mulatto. One parent is white, one parent is black, and she's been passing as white, and she's married to a white man. So not only is it the problem of a mulatto who's passing as a white person, which is dramatic in itself, but she's married to a white man, which in the South was literally against the law. There were miscegenation laws, especially in Mississippi, that were very harsh, very, very harsh indeed. And we follow the drama of Julie, and it's not trivialized at all. The poor woman has to live hidden from the truth, hiding her truth from the world. And when the company and the law discover her true identity, she voluntarily leaves the showboat because the people on the showboat have loved her and have protected her. And out of care and concern for them, she sacrifices her own security by leaving with her husband for what is ultimately her own doom, as we find out in Act 2. And the character of Julie, though she really appears very little in the show in terms of time on the stage, is a very pitiable and a very moving character. Showboat was an innovation in many ways. It was the first time that black and white choruses were presented in a show, and each of them had, in a sense, equal time and equal stature. It was uncommon enough to have a black chorus or any black performers in an otherwise white show, but in this particular case, the black and white chorus actually sing in counterpoint with each other and appear on the stage together. And I know that seems incredibly trivial today, but it was a landmark of an experience in 1927 when Ziegfeld did it. And it's not only a compliment to the creativity of Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, but when you think about the financial risk that it presented to Florence Ziegfeld, it's a tremendous comment upon the bravery of this man that he would do something like this.
But Showboat did, Chairman, and of course I had many strange reactions to it because, first of all, I came expecting to see a Florence Ziegfeld show, and then there was suddenly there was a scene with a little girl being let into a nunnery, and there were these ladies, you know, in there, nuns.
Not dressed like a Ziegfeld girls.
Yeah, exactly, and I was sort of awed and taken aback. And also the splendor of the production. And I was young enough to be taken in by the whole story and the life cycle.
That he would have a Broadway show open with the lines, "Niggers all work on the Mississippi, niggers all work while the white folks play, loading up boats with the bales of cotton, getting no rest till the judgment day." That's a very daring quatrain with which to open a Broadway musical in an era when audiences were accustomed to hearing nice-looking white people come out with tennis rackets and sing about playing tennis on the lawn in Long Island, or gee, I want to be a star in a Ziegfeld show, or something like that. The themes of Broadway musicals were essentially rather trivial in those days.
He was terribly worried about it. It was a complete departure from anything that certainly that he'd ever done, anything in the musical comedy theater. I always had a sneaking suspicion that the reason he really didn't like it was because the girls had so much clothes on. You know, those old-time clothes. And although they were the most beautiful things you ever saw, but I always felt that way about him. But he bellyached and carried on and griped and complained all the time about Showboat. The song he hated, absolutely hated, but couldn't make Jerry Kern and Oscar Hammerstein take out of the show was Old Man River. He hated that song. But on the road it was fine. Everything went fine and the critics liked it and all that sort of thing. And when we came into New York, and opened at the Ziegfeld Theater. And Mr. Ziegfeld was so sure that they weren't going to like it. He just was so sure. But during the performance, the opening night, nobody applauded. They sat there in shock. That's the only way we could describe it. Mr. Ziegfeld and I sat on the stairs in the back of the theater leading up to the balcony, and he was crying. I mean, the tears. I knew this goddamn show wasn't going to be any good. I knew it wasn't. I told them, and they wouldn't listen, and they wouldn't listen. And I said, well, Mr. Ziegfeld, they're not applauding because they're enjoying it. Oh, you're crazy, you know what you're talking about. And I mean, this went on till the end of the show. And finally, there was applause, of course, you know, but nothing like you would expect from a great big hit. And he and the general manager went somewhere, and we went around to a speakeasy and waited for the news and the reviews, and they were sensational. They're absolutely sensational. And the next morning, you couldn't get to the box office. The line was 2 blocks long. And I called him on the phone, and I said, you better get down here. You won't believe what you see out here. So he did come down for once, and he was beside himself with joy, of course. You know.
The song Bill, which seems so connected with Julie's character, was actually written in 1918 for Kern's Princess musical, Oh Lady Lady, with lyrics by P.G. Wodehouse. It was removed from that show because its description didn't fit the leading man. Kern next tried to put it into Sally in 1920, but Marilyn Miller's voice was too small to make it effective. In Showboat, it would become one of the most moving moments in the show and seemed to have been written for just that one particular spot, and for Helen Morgan, who created the role of Julie.
She was a triste person. That's the only word I can think of. She was very beautiful and very sensuous and very quiet and loving and warm. But also terribly vulnerable. She was exactly what Julie was, but she was fascinating in that way. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't exotic, this is my opinion, but she had embracing qualities about her. I just adored her, but then I was 9 years old, you know, but other people, of course, saw these qualities and interpreted them in different ways. And of course, Dad and Jerry Kern were fascinated by her qualities to the extent that they wrote a show just for her called Sweet Adeline. And they wrote just the right kinds of songs for her to sing, sort of melancholy songs. It was the first time that they dealt with human drama and miscegenation, with prejudice, and they showed that musical theater could deal with serious subjects. It wasn't just a place to go and watch the girls kick up their heels and listen to some swell songs, but this, in 1927, really brought the musical theater to maturity.
In our next segment, we'll show what influence, if any, Showboat had on the immediate future of the musical theater.